There is one war story that everybody needs to hear at least once. It is the crazy story of how this small group of Russian soldiers during World War I defended Osoviec Fortress in Poland. It is both absolutely horrific and utterly inspiring.
Yeah, go for it.
I guarantee you, it's nothing like any other war story you've ever heard.
I'm curious on his take.
Before we get
I know
into
the
that
basic
story,
gist of Osoviec.
if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week.
Ballin'.
So, if that's of interest to you,
For lack of a
please
better word,
sneak
ballin'.
into the like button's house, take all their fresh eggs out of the fridge,
No.
hard boil them, and
Bro.
then put them back.
Bro!
Also, please subscribe
That's
to
like-
our channel and turn on
that's
all
like a mortgage
notifications
with
so you
today's
don't
current
miss
egg
any
prices.
of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story.
I would play the song, but just would get this part demonetized.
On the morning of
YouTube
August
upload.
3rd, 1915, during World War I, a 21-year-old
It was
Russian
World War I,
soldier
fuck.
named Vladimir Kotlinski
World War
looked
I
out
was
from behind the huge stone walls of Osoviec Fortress in Poland. Out in front of him, he saw the same landscape he had been looking at for the last 6 months that he had been stationed at this fortress. It was a big, swampy forest that surrounded them
All of the
on all
Sabaton
sides.
fans in here know where this is going.
Additionally, in this swampy forest around them on all sides were dozens and dozens of trenches. Trenches are long, deep pits that soldiers will dig to both
is
hide
not
inside of when they're being attacked, and then also to launch their own attacks out of from behind their dirt walls.
that the Germans?
And these
The helmet?
trenches that zigged and zagged all around Osoviec Fortress were created by and now occupied by 7,000 German soldiers. And during World War I, the Russians were fighting the Germans.
Yep.
The Germans really wanted to take Osoviec Fortress from the Russians. It was in a great strategic position with a railway passing right through it. There was also a river nearby and a main road,
It
meaning
looks
whoever owned this
pretty, but you can
fortress
tell there's
was greatly aided in
lot of death
moving
and
critical
suffering in
wartime supplies and troops in a very hotly contested area. But despite the repeated attempts by these 7,000 Germans to take
legendary,
over
Tamsin.
Osoviec Fortress over the past 6 months, they had all been repelled
You're 21,
by
but can
Vladimir
still do
and the
things. Think of
puny
it that way.
900-man Russian force inside of the fortress.
And I get that comparison a lot, actually, Gotcha, to segue really quick. Just because you look back at World War I and World War II, and you had kids, effectively, going off to war, 18, 20, it was a different time. And don't lament the suffering that they went through. Yes, a lot of them did become heroes. Just because you're 21, 27, 28, 30, 35, just because you have age on the people that went off to war, they went through incredible suffering. World War I especially was absolutely fucked. And you may not be upset by it, but there are people that absolutely are like, well, what have I done with my life? Do the best you can every single day. As long as you can go to bed at the end of the day, whenever that is, saying you did everything you could, that's all anyone can really ask for. So just keep that in mind if anyone is thinking, well, I'm X, but I haven't really done anything. Just do what you can every single day.
And so, by that morning, August 3rd, 1915, as Vladimir is looking out from the battlements over the trenches in the
Yes, I
marsh
did
down
see about that
below,
movie. That was
it was
neat.
like both the Russians and the Germans had reached a sort of stalemate,
Mm-hmm.
where neither side was trying to attack the other, and neither
Exactly
side
right,
was
Secret.
leaving. They were just
Secret
kind of
seems-
staying put and doing nothing. In fact, over the last few weeks, there had been so little action from either side that the Russian soldiers inside the fortress got so bored, they began sneaking out the side door of the fortress to try to catch fish with their bare hands.
This is
in
when
the
they're gonna
nearby
bring in the
river.
chemical
But
weapons.
this morning, as Vladimir stood atop the wall,
Does it really
he
snap an
noticed
hour?
something strange happening in one of the trenches that was located closest to the fortress. It was still several hundred feet away, but he could see clearly down into this trench. And what he saw was there was this cluster of high-ranking German officers that were kind of huddled together, and they kept looking down at the ground at something inside of the trench that
Oh, no.
Vladimir couldn't see, and then they would look up at the sky and kind of wave their hands around, and then they'd look back down at the ground below them. Now, Vladimir had no idea what they were doing. I mean, again, he could not see what they were looking at in the trench, and when he looked up into
I'll
the
check
sky
my
where
mic.
they seemed to be looking. It just looked like a regular blue sky. But whatever they were doing, it was making Vladimir feel nervous. Vladimir was a young junior officer, which meant he was in charge of other soldiers, but because he was so new, he lacked experience and credibility, and so really wasn't considered a serious leader within the army. And so Vladimir, as he's watching this strange behavior, was concerned that if he left now and told his superiors that he was worried,
they're gonna gas them out of that fort. Oh no.
About the Germans because they were looking at the sky funny and looking at the ground funny, that it would make him look like he was being paranoid and not a good leader. And so ultimately, Vladimir just looked at this cluster inside of the trench and decided, you know what, they're not shooting at us, there's no attack happening, so whatever they're doing, it can't be that big of a deal. And lately, no one's done anything, so why would that change now? And so Vladimir left the walls of Osoviec Fortress and went down below to hang out with his friends. 3 days later, at 4 in the morning, the Russian soldiers who were up along the Osoviec fortress walls keeping watch that night noticed something strange out in the darkness near where the Germans were. When they looked out, they saw that the dark night air almost looked kind of blurry or wavy, kind of like if you were looking at air coming off of hot pavement on a sunny day, it would look kind of blurry. That's what the night sky looked like to them. But of course, it couldn't be because of heat and sun, because it's the morning, it's cold, it's dark outside. And so as these Russians are looking out, not sure what to make of this blurry air, they began calling up more Russians to go have a look and figure out what this was. And over the next couple of minutes, as the Russians looked out from behind the walls at this air, they realized what it was. It was this huge grayish-green cloud that was as wide as the fortress was, and the wind was blowing it in their direction. Now, the Russian soldiers had no idea what this was, and so they just kind of stood there watching it in stunned silence. And as they watched, they saw as the cloud would touch any vegetation.
So, like, you know in Return of the King, right? Lord of the Rings Return of the King by the Peter Jackson film, when Gandalf and the other Gondorians are looking out over the wall and Gron starts being brought up and how they're just like, what the fuck is that? Similar vibe to that. Because, like, you look at this shimmering cloud of, you're not sure what it is. You just, and that's the thing, you really don't. The fact, like, the wind is going to carry that over to you sooner rather than later. You don't. Like, the Germans waited for the wind to be in the right direction.
Like leaves on trees or the high grass in the marsh, it would all turn black and shrivel up. And then the soldiers began hearing a soft thump, 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 thump out in the darkness. And it was the sound of birds dying and falling to the ground that were inside of this cloud. At this point, the Russians began to panic and they began to run to sound the alarm to get the other soldiers up to prepare for an attack. But as they did, they began to smell this very harsh chemical smell coming into the fortress. And then before long, all the Russians could hear was the sound of their comrades coughing. It would turn out that strange behavior that Vladimir saw 3 days earlier of the German officers huddled together looking at the sky and then looking down at the ground and then back at the sky again. What they were doing was preparing for a chemical attack on Osoviec Fortress. On the ground, out of sight of Vladimir, were canisters containing the poisonous gas, and when the officers would look up and put their hands up, they were gauging if the wind was strong enough and in the right direction to launch the attack. Now, 3 days ago, the wind had not been in their favor,
chemical weapons
but
are just
this morning at 4 a.m. on
It's
August
a
6th,
different scale of
1915, the wind had been in their favor, and they had released the gas. And this gas was quite possibly the worst gas you could ever come up against on the battlefield. It was a combination of chlorine gas and bromine gas. On their own, chlorine and bromine are very toxic and can kill you. But when you mix those two gases, it becomes exponentially more dangerous. The gas mixture
Why you don't mix
binds
chemicals
to
in a
moisture
fucking kitchen?
and then turns the moisture into
so upset about
hydrochloric acid. Meaning, if a person who did not have a gas mask on came in contact with this poisonous gas, when they inhaled it, it would literally fill their lungs with acid, which would dissolve them from the inside out. And then also, the gas would get into their eyes and into their nose, and the acid there would burrow holes into their skull. And once you've come in contact with this gas, there's nothing anybody can do to save you. You're gonna die, except except
7.
it's going to take
That
a
was the 70s.
really, really long time. You don't just immediately dissolve. It's this long, drawn-out, excruciatingly painful process. By this point in World War I, chemical warfare was really not being used by anybody, and so as a result, the Russian army did not outfit their soldiers with gas masks. The German army did, and they knew the Russian army did not. So, as this horrific poisonous gas began permeating
20%.
every square inch of Osoviec fortress, all of these Russian soldiers had nothing they could do to protect themselves from this gas. And so right away, soldiers began bleeding from their eyes and their mouths and their ears, and they literally began coughing up chunks of their lung. And so very quickly, the Russians inside the fortress understood they were being poisoned. And so these soldiers that were not as affected, at least not right away, by this gas, quickly began ripping off their shirts, dunking them in water, and wrapping them around their heads to try to limit how much they breathed in of this chemical. But it really didn't do much to stop the chemical. In fact, these makeshift gas masks might have made it worse because the gas would have bound to the moisture on the shirt. And so the Russians were totally doomed. They were surrounded on all sides outside the walls by their enemy, and then inside the fortress was this gas, and there was no ventilation in the fortress, and so there was nowhere to go. They couldn't escape death no matter where they went. And so Vladimir, he was one of the guys that was still on his feet inside of the fortress, and he stumbled over to this narrow window on the side of the fortress walls, and he looked out and he saw all these Germans running towards them, firing their machine guns, artillery's being fired. I mean, he knows they are moments away from the Germans breaching the fortress door, coming inside, and killing every last one of them. But Vladimir's reaction to this was not being scared or being sad. Instead, he suddenly felt incredibly motivated. If they're going to come in here and kill us, then we're going to make it as hard as humanly possible first. Vladimir had a reputation for being
soldier
totally
with nothing
fearless.
to lose is arguably the hardest thing you could ever fight.
Over the past 6 months that they had been under siege from the German army out in their trenches, anytime fighting broke out, Vladimir was always the first to run up and be right on the front line of fighting, and then several times when his comrades had been shot or wounded, Vladimir would run out into the line of fire to save the fallen soldiers. It was like Vladimir lacked any instinct for self-preservation. And so as the Germans continued their run towards the fortress, artillery shells are hitting the walls, there's constant gunfire, and Vladimir, he leaves his window and he marches back over to the open courtyard inside of this fortress where the 100 or so other still living Russian soldiers were. I mean, they're all gonna die. They've been totally poisoned by this gas, and it's just a matter of time now, but they're still on their feet, and Vladimir walks over to them, and even though, again, he's pretty junior, he stands up and he says to them, "This is our moment. We are all going to die.
A good
but what we do right now will define us." And the way Vladimir said it, he got those 100 soldiers who were on death's door to be so motivated so quickly that they rallied to him. And so as these men are literally bleeding out of their eyes, their mouths, they're coughing up pieces of their lung, Vladimir explained the plan. And then moments later, with Vladimir in the front, this gaggle of soon-to-die Russian soldiers charged towards the gates, opened the fortress, and began running out towards the Germans, screaming with their bayonets lowered. Now, the Germans on the outside fully expected that this chemical attack would kill all of the Russians. That taking Osoviec fortress would be super routine because when they walked in, everybody would be dead. And so suddenly to have the fortress open and have these men that are covered in bloody rags and they're puking up pieces of their organs and they're stumbling forward like zombies with bayonets out, screaming like banshees, it scared the living out of the Germans. In fact, they were so quickly terrified by what they saw, they literally dropped their guns, turned, and began running back towards their trenches.
We're not doing
and as they did, Vladimir and his dead man army began picking off the Germans one by one. And then after Vladimir and the dead man army ran out of ammunition, they just continued staggering forward directly into the thousands of Germans in front of them and began picking up dead German weapons and firing them. And then when they got up to the trenches where these retreating retreating Germans had been so scared they had run into their own barbed wire. And so there's all these retreating Germans stuck on the barbed wire. The Russians just began bayoneting all these men that were stuck. And so at some point, as Vladimir is doing this, a German soldier ran up to him and bayoneted Vladimir right in the stomach. He ran him all the way through until the barrel of the gun was right up against his stomach.
All the way
and
through.
Vladimir apparently looked down at this bayonet, knew he had been completely run through, and he looked up at the German who had just stabbed him, who was still holding the gun, and Vladimir spit blood and lung tissue all over this German's face, and then just began screaming directly at this guy. And so the German was so scared, he just dropped the gun, turned, tried to run, and then Vladimir was back on his gun with the bayonet still in his stomach, shooting at the Germans. The Germans were so completely caught off guard and terrified by Vladimir's dead man army counterattack that even though they outnumbered the Russians 70-1, they failed to take Osoviec fortress. The main reason for that was the Germans who had escaped the counterattack and made it back to their trenches. They told the other German soldiers that the Russians had turned into zombies, literally, that they were undead, and so attacking them was pointless. They're already dead. And the Germans were so scared, they refused to leave their trenches again. Once the Russians could tell they had successfully forced a retreat by the German army, Vladimir, who was still alive at this point with a gun still stuck in his gut from the bayonet, he called out to the rest of his soldiers to retreat back to the fortress. And so this handful of Russian soldiers who were about to die, they hobbled their way back inside of their fortress, and then Vladimir gave his final command. Destroy the fortress. If we can't have it,
they can't have it.
Nobody can. Every single Russian soldier that came in contact with that poisonous gas died, including Vladimir. When the Germans did eventually take Osoviec fortress at a later date, when again, all of the Russians were dead, when the Germans went inside, they realized the fortress had been destroyed and it was no longer strategically valuable. Vladimir would be awarded posthumously Russia's highest military honor. His actions and the actions of the other dying soldiers that fought alongside him are remembered today in stories, songs, and statues
Sabaton.
All across Russia.
Absolute fucking legend. Like, just they're just built different.
$250,000. That's how much you all contributed to Dave Hartsock's GoFundMe page after we covered his story on our YouTube channel. Dave is the heroic skydiver who sacrificed his body to save his student. Now, because of that, Dave is totally paralyzed and fully dependent on his mother to take care of him. I spoke to Dave after all this money came in, and to say he's happy is such an understatement.
Awesome.
I mean, this literally changed his life, and it's because of you. But as awesome as that is, our work is not done. There are other very deserving people that really could use our help. And one group in particular that really needs attention are the victims of violent crime as well as their families. And that is where the MrBallen Foundation comes into play. Within days of the Uvalde Elementary School shooting, the MrBallen Foundation sent $150,000 to support victims and their families. And going forward, we will continue to support them as long as they need support. This year, in addition to all the donations we expect to receive, our company, Ballen Studios, which is a separate entity, is going to be giving $1 million to the MrBallen Foundation.
Awesome.
And all of it will go to the cause. We are not taking any money for profit in MrBallen Foundation. Truly, 100% of donations that go into that foundation go to the cause. And if you don't know this, that is very rare for most charities. Usually, you got to pull money to pay for the organization. Not for us. It is 100%. You give money to the MrBallen Foundation, it goes right out the door to victims of violent crime and their families. So, if you want to join forces with me and the MrBallen Foundation and genuinely make a difference in the lives of people that so desperately need our help, go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved at the top of the page. Once there, consider becoming a monthly donor to the Honor Them Society. These supporters not only contribute to the cause, but also they get free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Again, go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to see how you can partner up with me and the MrBallen Foundation.
Which is awful secret final boss. So if someone advertises that 100% goes to it, you know, and it's
So that's going to do
citable.
it. If you got something out of today's
Way
episode
better.
and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the like button's house
You can be
and
educated
remove
on
all of their
doing
fresh
donations.
eggs from
It is
their
possible,
fridge,
yes.
hard boil them, and then put them back. Also, please subscribe to our
Poor like
channel
button.
and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings we upload the remastered audio of our best YouTube
I like when he
videos.
uploads.
Again, the
I actually started
podcast is
saving
just
it for
called the
streams.
MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to
Like, once again, I
MrBallen.Foundation
can't, like,
and click on
say
Get
enough that
Involved
how
to
cool
join
this
the
is.
Honor Them
How cool
Society
that
today. We have 2
he's
additional
able to
YouTube
do
channels,
that, and that
Mr. Ballen
he feels
Shorts
so
and
strongly
Mr.
about
Ballen
it,
and
right?
Espanol. We also
Absolutely
put out
amazing.
near
The fact
daily
that also has
content
a
on
Spanish
TikTok,
version.
Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those channels are just called Mr. Ballen. If you want to get in touch with me,
If I knew enough
please
Spanish,
follow
I could
me
make
on
Kip
any
in
major
Espanol.
social media
But no.
platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just at Mr. Ballen,
Protectors.
and I really do read the majority
neat.
of
No,
my
this
DMs.
is,
to check out
Dead
our
Men from
merch, to
Sabaton,
join
what
our
this was
Discord
about.
server, or just see what things are going on within our studio, go to our brand new website,
I also like that he tags his shit with, like,
ballenstudios.com.
distressing
So
images
whether
and
I
stuff,
see you
or,
on
like,
Instagram,
anxiety
Twitter,
warning,
TikTok, Reddit,
like,
YouTube, Facebook,
he's
other
doing
YouTube
a
channels,
lot.
the podcast, wherever,
for-
just
for a
know
lot
that I
of
really
people,
appreciate your
that
support.
means a lot.
And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
The fact that he started in 2020, like, goddamn.